This video I'm going to talk about subqueries, and also I'm going to end it with a little bit about the merge keyword, which works in Oracle. Although not all database engines will work with all the syntax that you see here. However, I'll show you as much as I can. So first I'll talk about single row subqueries, and then we'll talk about multi-row subqueries. Just like when we talked about functions, I talked about single row and multi-row functions, right? Single and aggregate functions. So we've already talked about the syntax for a select statement. Nothing really changes here, but we can substitute certain components of the select statement with subqueries. So for example, we can use subqueries in the select portion of the clause. We can use subqueries in the where portion. We could use it in the from portion in the place of a table name. So lots of neat things that we can do with subqueries. Let's get started. So first, let's take a look at this table. I can select from this table where the title of a book is digital electronics. We've already learned how to do this, right? It's a pretty basic select statement with a where clause, and it works. So what I get here when I run that query, maybe what I'm looking for is the retail price of that book. So in this case, the retail price of the book is $130. Now that I know how much digital electronics costs, maybe I want to find out what all of the books are that cost more than that book, right? Maybe I'm doing some analytics and I want to figure out, which books are more expensive. So then I could write another query. Again, we learned how to do this. And I could just change the where clause where the retail price is greater than 130. We already learned how to do this. So if I gave you an assignment and said, return a list of all the books that are more expensive than digital electronics, I think most of you could figure this out, right? You would probably do something like this. However, you could do this with a single subquery instead of two queries. And it would look like, let me fast forward here. So it would look a little bit like this. So what we do here is we take the first query and we simply embed it in the second query, right? What I'm really looking for is all the books that are more expensive than a certain amount. What is that amount? It's whatever amount I get from the select statement where the title is digital electronics. So what's going to happen is in the parentheses, by the way, subqueries are typically run within parentheses. The database engine is going to run that query and return that result, and then that result is substituted for what's in the parentheses in the where clause in the outer query. It's important to mention that when you use a single row query, anywhere that the database engine is expecting a single row, so this would be any subquery in a select statement, any subquery in a where clause, typically, well, not all queries in a where clause. You'll see some examples here in a few minutes, but if it's expecting a single result, but you get more than a single result, then the database engine is going to return an error. So you have to have just a single result if you're using a single row query. Again, you'll get an error in the database engine if you don't do that. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll add a limit to the query to make sure we only get one result. That way, if for some reason you get more than one, it doesn't throw an error. So sometimes it's best practice to do that when you're doing a single row query. Just make sure you're only going to get one. And again, you would have to do that if you're not doing a single row function, right? If you have a single row function without a group by clause, then you're always going to get a single row. So you don't really have to do a limit or a top in those. It's top in Microsoft SQL Server, limit in most other database engines, or row num in Oracle. But you don't have to do that if you're doing a single row function. So again, that's what our subquery looks like. This is a basic example with a subquery in the where clause. Let's take a look at some other examples. And by the way, there's our results. We have 3 books that are more than $130 in our table. So we already learned how to do single row functions, right? So this is an example of a single row function. It's going to return the maximum retail cost from our books table, right? It's going to tell us which one of these books is the most expensive. In this case, it's the one that's $185, right? But which book was that was $185? Well, we might want to return both the name of the book and the retail cost of the book. One way you could do this, if you do select max retail cost and then publisher, is, normally we would add to this a group by clause so we see the maximum retail cost by publisher. That's going to give me multiple rows. What if I only want one answer, right? I only want the one book. There's other ways you could do this, but a subquery is one way you could do that. So first, I'm going to select the maximum retail cost from books. That gives me the book that has the maximum cost. Then I'm just going to do this select statement again, but I'm only going to get back one result. Because I have that subquery, because that subquery only gives me one result, the database engine lets me do this without a group by clause, because we're always going to get a single result back. It knows that because there's only one result and there's only one answer in our table. Theoretically, you could have more than one result, and if that were to happen, you would get an error if there was more than one result with that subquery, or with the where clause rather. So if I were to run that, instead of just getting 185, I get the publisher and 185, right? So it makes a little more sense. Now I can see who the publisher is that's charging us the most for their books. So let's take a look at another example. Here we have a query where we're going to get the title and the retail cost, and we want to get the difference between the retail cost and the average, right? So what we're doing here is we're looking at the averages. Again, we're kind of analyzing here, which publishers are the most profitable, right? Which publishers are getting the most profit from their books by showing, how they deviate from the average, right? So some of them are going to be above average, some of them are going to have below average retail cost. And that's going to be our third column. So the first column is title, the second column is the retail cost, the third column is the retail cost minus a subquery, which is the average. So we're using a subquery to get the average first. That value is substituted and then subtracted from the retail minus cost, right? So that tells us what the difference is between retail and cost, which is our profit. So we're taking the profit and subtracting that from the average profit, and then we're getting what the average profit is. And when we run that, we can see a list of our textbooks and who is the least and most profitable. So it looks like the least is going to be basic electronics, and the most profitable is transistor electronics, right? All right. Here's another example of a subquery. This is a multi-row subquery. If we were looking for, so in this example, we have a list of books. This is our inventory, right? This list of books. But then people are ordering books, right? We're just, again, I made this up, but let's say people order books from this company, and we have a table of orders. If I wanted to see a list of all of the books that are in an order, I can use a subquery, right? So select title from orders returns a list of all the books that appear, all the titles of books that appear in orders. Now, normally when we use the in query or the in operator, right? We learned about that previously. In a where clause, when you use the in operator, in the parentheses, you're putting a list of, you're listing things with commas typically, right? So, value, value, or you might, have integers, comma separated. In this example, instead of listing all the titles, we're just going to select them, right? So I can use a select statement to get that list, and it's going to check to see if the value is in that list. So when I do that, I can see that the only book that was never ordered is that basic electronics book. So that disappears from my list at the bottom because that, wouldn't be in this list. And just like I can do in, I can do not in, right? So I can just say, give me a list of all the books that no one's ever ordered, or we don't have any orders in the invoice table. And then all I get back is basic electronics because it's the only one that was never ordered. There are other operators that you can use. These are some of the operators that you have available for you in multi-row queries. You have greater than all, less than any, greater than any, equal to any. These don't work in all database engines, but they'll work in some of them. So greater than all is when you have your result set, it's going to be all the values that are greater than the highest value. And then likewise, less than all is going to be all the values less than the lowest value. Any is going to be less than the highest value, so it's all of the return values plus anything that's less than that. And then more is the same thing, but from the lowest value above. And then any is basically your inquiry. That's your standard inquiry, which is the same as saying in something, right? Okay, another example, multiple column. So here, instead of, normally we learned about the join already, right? We learned how to join different tables, but not only can you join different tables, but you can join a table to a select statement. What this basically does, prior to this, when I was showing you the examples, when I had a subquery in a parenthetical, I was selecting a single value, right? And that single value was, substituted for whatever is inside the parentheses. In this case, we are selecting a table, right? So this is more or less like a data structure, right? If you're in programming, we talk about data structures. So you're selecting an entire table, and that table that you're selecting, so that select statement is treated as if it were a table. That's why we can use a join with it. So we can join not only to tables, but also to subqueries. So what's happening here is we're creating sort of a dynamic table when we run the query that has its columns are the publisher, the average retail cost, and we gave that column a name, pub average, and that's coming from the books table. And it's grouped by publisher. So we'll have a list of all the publishers and what their average profit is on those books. Okay? And then we're going to use those columns, right? So if you look at the top, I'm using those columns. We have retail cost and then the pub average and the publisher, right? So we're using those column names from that other table. So if I oh, by the way, this is a select from the same table, right? So it's not a different table. We're just creating a subquery based on the same table, which you can certainly do. So when I run that query, now I get an extra column, right? I get the average. I have the retail minus cost, right? And then I have the average for each one of those publishers. So another type of subquery, you can use the exists keyword in the where clause. This is very similar to using the in keyword, so it works pretty much almost the same way, right? So here again, we're showing a list of books where their title appears in the orders, right? So where they have orders. Here's another example. This is a nested subquery. So you can nest your subqueries. It can get kind of complicated, but let's follow along here. So in this case, we're trying to find out what the department name is of the highest paid employee. So which department has the highest paid employee? So we have our employee table on the right side, which has their salary, and then we have our departments on the left, which show the department number and the name of the department, right? Although I think I've got something wrong here. Where it says Sam, Dick, and Harry on the left should be department number 1, 2, and 3, right? So I pasted that in wrong, but you get the idea, right? So how would I do this? So first I want the department name and I want the highest paid employee. That's really what I'm looking for here, right? So when I'm asking these questions, you have to try to find the salient portions of the question and translate that into a SQL query. So first I'm going to find the employee, or I'm going to find the amount that is the max salary. So which is the maximum salary? So first we answer that question. Then we're going to find the department number for the maximum salary. So show me the department number where the salary is equal to the maximum salary. So that's the next subquery. Then I got to find the name of that department. So I'm going to select the name from department where the department number is equal to the department number of the salary where the salary is the maximum salary. Okay? So we have 3 nested queries here, and that should give me the answer that I'm looking for. And then finally, this is one last example of a merge. Again, not all database engines will support this, but merge basically lets you merge the values from 2 tables, from one table into another table. So it's typically where you're looking for values that didn't exist in the other table. So in this example here at the bottom, you can see that Anne-Marie McKenzie is not in the second table, right? Or Trish McMillan, rather. Sorry. Oh yeah, there's Anne-Marie McKenzie. Trish McMillan has a different value for the salary. So it's going to go ahead and merge the values from these 2 different tables. So it's a little bit like an if-else statement when you read the syntax of this query. In this course, it's not important that you understand how to do this query. We're going to cover this in more detail in another course, but I wanted to show you an example of what this looks like. So that's subqueries. And in my next video, we're going to talk about views.